Welcome back again, everyone. Thanks for tuning in to the China History Podcast. This is your host, Laszlo Montgomery, back with another episode in our little overview of Singapore, the penultimate episode in this series. Last time we made it to Singapore independence, August 9th, 1965, after what turned out to be irreconcilable differences. The marriage between Singapore and Malaysia failed, and they called the whole thing off. And you could say friendly relations between Singapore and Malaysia took a nasty hit after all that bad blood, all those incendiary speeches, the riots, the hard feelings, the past history. That was going to take some time to heal. Hey, words have consequences, man. Threats had been made and implied that gave Singapore's leaders an unsettling feeling. Malaysian leaders early on had said words to the effect that, if Singapore did anything to piss them off, then, they could always cut off the water supply that was piped in from Johor. There was even this cynical belief that Singapore would fall on its face and come running back to Malaysia, begging to merge again. Malaysian troops still remained in Singapore at the time of separation, and that posed somewhat of a threat. The same went with the local police force as well. Had UMNO leaders called for it, they could have caused a fair amount of trauma. Despite everything we know today about Singapore's rise and oversized importance to the world economy, no one back in 1965 was feeling particularly confident. That was one overarching reason why Foreign Minister S. Rajaratnam had to hit the road and start signing up countries who would offer Singapore diplomatic recognition. The foreign minister was racing to establish diplomatic relations with as many nations as possible. This would give Singapore some standing in the world, politically at least, and offer the government some semblance of security as far as what Malaysia might do if they chose to, which they didn't. The entire Ministry of Foreign Affairs back then was basically S. Rajaratnam and an assistant. Not much to work with when he started, which makes Rajaratnam's achievement as a founding foreign minister even more remarkable. S. Rajaratnam wrote the 38 words of Singapore's Pledge of Allegiance, same as in America and in other countries. When students begin their day at school, they recite this pledge. What S. Rajaratnam believed in and aspired for as far as the soul of Singapore, to be a non-communal nation, is contained in these words, quote, "We, the citizens of Singapore, pledge ourselves as one united people, regardless of race, language, or religion, to build a democratic society based on justice and equality, so as to achieve happiness, prosperity, and progress for our nation." After August 9th, 1965, Singaporean people had to get it in their heads that they were now Singaporean nationals, not colonists, not part of the Straits Settlements, not part of the Malaysian Federation. They were their own nation now, and all that meant. At the moment of independence on August 9th, 1965, Singapore was cut off from Malaysia's hinterland. And to the south in Indonesia, they didn't welcome Singapore either. Both Muslim nations put the kibosh on commodity exports destined for processing in Singapore. The entrepot trade that had served Singapore so well going back to Temasek and Singapura in the 14th century was dealt quite a serious blow. That was how Singapore had survived and thrived for all these centuries, the entrepot trade. Being an international mart, conveniently located along major sea routes where traders from all nations, from around the region and around the world, came to buy and sell goods. So that all dried up. Although this will change once we discuss the achievements of Dr. Goh Keng Swee, there was hardly any export industry to speak of in Singapore. The demographic of the country was also quite young, and youth unemployment was in a bad way. The way lower and lower middle class people lived compared to today, there's no comparison. 不一样的天空. There was a lot to do, and unfortunately for Singapore's leadership, it was all urgent and had to be addressed immediately. It wasn't all bad for Singapore. After all, they still had that stupendous geographic location and magnificent port. They had always counted for something, even in the worst of times. Although they couldn't wait to see the last of them, the British, since Raffles planted the flag there, had left behind many institutions that were put in place while they were around. And those still remained, and having the good fortune for all that to be in place from the get-go shouldn't be underestimated. The system of justice, government administration, the education system, and basic infrastructure. It wasn't like Singapore in that hot summer of 1965, the year of the snake. It's not like they had to start from scratch. The first 5 countries to extend diplomatic recognition to Singapore were Malaysia, followed by Egypt, India, Indonesia, and the United Kingdom. And other countries, too, demonstrated from day one that they were friends of Singapore. There were countries, and there were also individual people who, at Singapore's most precarious hour, stepped up and lent a hand. Perhaps most noteworthy of all from this time was a man who, outside of Singapore and the Netherlands perhaps, isn't too well known. Singapore's founding fathers all held this person in extremely high regard. He was a Dutch economist named Dr. Albert Winsemius. Dr. Winsemius worked with the United Nations and was part of the 1961 UN survey mission to Singapore. He had previously overseen the post-war recovery for the Netherlands, and he ended up serving as an economic advisor to the Singapore government from 1961 to 1984. During his time there in 1961, he delivered a report to the government that made a number of recommendations. In his report, Winsemius said, first and foremost, Singapore had to deal decisively with its communist problem. Remember, this was 1961, and the PAP then was not yet anywhere near the PAP it would later turn into come the 1970s. It was riddled with a lot of left-leaning, Marxist-appreciating members who often gave the likes of Kuan Yew a big headache. So Winsemius said, you got to deal with that by hook or by crook. Another recommendation Dr. Winsemius gave was to leave the statue of Sir Stamford Raffles right where it stood at Boat Quay. He advised them not to be tempted to push it in the river or tear it down. If the new Singapore government heeded these words and overcame its communist problem, he said, quote, together these actions would signal to the world that Singapore was a politically stable country that was not governed by rabid anti-colonial nationalists, end quote. He also proposed a 5-stage plan that would provide a pathway for the country that would take it from the third world to the first world. He strongly advised Singapore's leaders to promote technical education first and foremost, what we call the STEM subjects today. Winsemius was advising the Singapore government to jump on this back in 1961, so he also recommended they turn Singapore into an international financial center and to make the port a regional and global sea and air cargo hub. Singapore had to walk before it could run. Winsemius advised the government to focus first on employing people, take measures that would create the most jobs. We saw this before in Taiwan and in Hong Kong, and it would happen again in China with reform and opening. Labor-intensive, export-oriented industrialization and manufacturing was the best place to start. Garments, food processing, and other mass-market consumer products were emphasized. It put a lot of people to work, both young and old. Public housing was also considered a must. People had to be moved out of these areas close to the city center and the port so that this land could be used more productively in other ways. And as we'll see, the same thing we saw happen in Hong Kong also happened in Singapore. This policy led to these massive public housing estates that started going up. Last time I briefly mentioned S. Rajaratnam, Singapore's first foreign minister, and I read excerpts from his speech at the UN following Singapore's independence. I'd like to now briefly introduce another founding father of Singapore who became chiefly responsible for taking all of Albert Winsemius's recommendations and turning them into government policy and ultimately to bring them to fruition. We in America, we have Washington, Adams, and Jefferson. In Singapore, they had Lee Kuan Yew, Goh Keng Swee, and S. Rajaratnam. Goh Keng Swee, or Wu Qing-rui in Mandarin, was born October 6, 1918, which made him 5 years older than Lee Kuan Yew. He was born in Malacca and came to Singapore in 1920. As a student at Raffles College, studying economics, he first met Lee Kuan Yew. He then entered the civil service and worked in the government until the Japanese arrived in 1942. On a scholarship program, Goh attended the London School of Economics and received his doctoral in 1956. And forevermore, Singaporeans always knew him as Dr. Goh. Like Lee Kuan Yew during his London period, Goh Keng Swee also had his political awakening. I mentioned the Malayan Forum, I think in Part 7, where the great local issues of the day were debated, and Goh Keng Swee was also part of that group. He co-founded the People's Action Party in 1954, along with Lee Kuan Yew and Dr. Toh Chin Chai. And upon his return from the UK, Dr. Goh went back into the civil service. Like most every one of his colleagues and in circles he traveled in, he wanted the British out of Singapore, and he ran on this platform in the historic 1959 elections and was one of the PAP winners that night. In his new government, Lee Kuan Yew made Dr. Goh his finance minister. Dr. Goh, he ran more than his share of cabinet ministries, and each one he was called upon to head up, he became an expert. Following the advice of Albert Winsemius, Dr. Goh went out and attracted multinational corporations. In 1961, he set up the government body that was assigned to develop the policy that would take Singapore to the heights of the first world nations, and this was the EDB, or Economic Development Board. One of the earliest international corporations to pay attention to what Goh Keng Swee was touting and to take advantage of the one-stop shopping that the EDB offered was Hewlett-Packard. William Hewlett himself came and personally met with Dr. Goh. They were out shopping for assemblers of their core memory devices for their HP 211X computers. HP made a huge bet on Singapore and went on to employ over 6,000 workers, technicians, and management. As one of the old stories went, one of the selling points for HP, besides the obvious lower labor costs, were the Singaporean women workers who were hired to do the intricate labor steps involving stringing the tiny donuts onto the fine copper wires in core memory production. Winsemius personally called on other Dutch companies, most notably Philips, to invest in factories in Singapore. Royal Dutch Shell was another Dutch giant to greatly expand its presence in Singapore. The leading names in American high-tech also beat a path to Singapore in the late 60s and early 70s. Besides HP, there was Texas Instruments, National Semiconductor, GE, Fairchild Semiconductor, and Seagate. They all liked what Goh Keng Swee was selling and bet big on Singapore. Part of the first strategy to attract foreign multinationals and local companies involved converting 15,000 acres of mostly swampland in Jurong into a model industrial park that would be self-contained and offer housing, health care, and employment to residents. Of course, this is so common now, but back then, this was the first time people were, in big numbers, leaving the comfort and familiarity of their traditional dwellings for these high-rise flats in formerly undesirable parts of Singapore. You can be sure there was a whole lot of resistance in the beginning, but people eventually did move out of the city center and set up their new nests out in the suburbs. These former residential districts were soon populated by new businesses and industrial buildings. As the 60s and 70s came and went, there were less and less unsightly squatter settlements, and Singapore's skyline was soon filled with these high-rise, high-density apartment blocks. It had been Albert Winsemius who had put this bug in Dr. Goh's ear to build the Jurong industrial state. In addition to the industrial part of Jurong, Dr. Goh also championed the creation of the world-famous Jurong Bird Park in 1971, and he turned Jurong into not only a place to live and work, but also a destination for tourists to visit and for local Singaporeans to take the family. The Jurong Bird Park and the Singapore Zoo were the showcase attractions, and they were both recently relocated to the Mandai Wildlife Preserve. This is now a whole nature complex which includes the Singapore Zoo, night safari, river wonders, bird paradise, and rainforest wild. Everything gets to take advantage of that glorious equatorial climate. The hardest part was the startup phase, but Singapore, with that magical location and trained workforce and its universities, under Dr. Goh and his sometimes controversial bulldoze and build campaigns, well, they got it together fast, and by 1968, there were more than 150 factories operating in the Jurong Industrial Park. And he got personally involved. As finance minister to a brand new country like Singapore, he couldn't fob this job off to underlings. He personally met with CEOs of these big companies and with local industrialists to get them to invest in Jurong. Every factory that went up, that put a lot of rice in a lot of bowls. The most basic and fundamental responsibility of any government. Dr. Goh also guided Singapore into the oil refining business. Now, I mentioned in a previous episode how the offshore islands had long been used by Royal Dutch Shell and Esso for storage and distribution. Now Singapore began swimming upstream, getting into more profitable value-added parts of the supply chain, such as refining, blending, bunkering, and distribution. Bunkering refers to a process of supplying marine fuel for ocean-going vessels. The PAP leadership had been saying it all along. Without that Malaysia hinterland in their backyard, it would profoundly affect their existing economic model. They relied on those natural resources in the domestic market to fuel the Singapore economy. And because he wasn't getting any love from his neighbors, Goh Keng Swee spent a lot of time on the road, going well beyond his borders and his region, drumming up investment. Regulators made Singapore a very attractive place for big banks to set up a branch. All these financial institutions that came in the 1960s gave Singapore's future as a global financial center a well-timed and well-needed boost. There was a race to internationalize Singapore in such a way as to make the place attractive to these multinationals. Dr. Goh went on to also serve as Minister of the Interior and Minister of Defense. He, more than anyone else, was responsible for turning the SAF, or Singapore Armed Forces, into an effective defensive force. It wasn't popular when it was announced, but he was the one who instituted the NS in 1967, the National Service. And he himself was made a colonel, and he was no honorary defense minister. He was hands-on and became an expert on the subject, surrounding himself with advisors from the best militaries in the world. At the very beginning, there was a great deal of help that came from the IDF, the Israel Defense Forces. They played a key role in turning Singapore's military into the most technologically advanced in Southeast Asia. He also set up SAF scholarships that sent many of Singapore's best and brightest out into the world to learn and come back and serve the nation. The current senior minister and son of Lee Kuan Yew, Mr. Lee Hsien Loong, was one of these scholars. In short, Goh Keng Swee was chiefly responsible for creating Singapore's military-industrial complex, including Singapore's own arms industry. When he began as Minister of Defense, there wasn't much there. And when he left it, the SAF was well on its way to becoming what it is today. And he did the same thing with Singapore's education system when he was appointed Education Minister in 1979. He made sweeping changes and completely turned the established system on its head. Perhaps best known was his system of streaming, an educational practice that grouped students into classes based on their perceived academic ability. For the same reason streaming isn't popular elsewhere, there was some resistance, but the system lasted for 30 years. And there's arguments for and against it, but it was controversial. Singapore's famous bilingual policy was also introduced during Dr. Goh's term as Education Minister. The 4 official languages of Singapore were English, Mandarin, Malay, and Tamil. Now, not all Indians in Singapore were Tamil. There were many other linguistic groups present in Singapore. The students whose first language was English had to learn Mandarin. Malay and Tamil-speaking students had to learn English. Chinese speakers, that is, those whose first languages were Hokkien, Teochew, and Hakka, and other dialects, had to learn Mandarin and English. The main idea was everyone had to learn 2 languages, of which one had to be English, or Singlish, as it came to be heard on the streets of the Lion City. Singlish was essentially English with Malay, Chinese, Tamil words, and other Singaporean natural flavorings and additives. The thought that drove all of these policy decisions instituted by Dr. Goh was to maximize on the future prospects of every individual, to try and do what was best for them, make them productive in society, and to get the most out of life. This was an early example of Singapore, the nanny state. A nanny state is one where the government itself passes laws and regulations that restrict and control the personal lives of its citizens. Goh Keng Swee was a very impatient person in that, well, he realized that a human's lifespan was limited, and he had a lot of big plans, most of which still affect Singaporean people today. And he was in a hurry to get things done, even something like promoting local culture, like developing the spectacular Krita Ayer part of Chinatown and moving all the street hawkers to an indoor food complex. Even down to this level, he got in on the details. Anyway, Goh Keng Swee was one of the greatest of the greats from that first generation of Singapore leaders who shepherded the island through the rough waters of the 1960s and 70s, and took risks and provided the leadership to set the ship of state right and on a course of greatness. He retired in 1984 after 25 years serving in the cabinet, the last 11 of those years as deputy prime minister. He created the Singapore Armed Forces out of nothing, made profound contributions to Singapore's education system. He promoted wildlife through his role in establishing the Jurong Bird Park and the Singapore Zoo. And though he wasn't a musician, he also championed the creation of the Singapore Symphony Orchestra. The combination of Goh Keng Swee and Lee Kuan Yew was quite a formidable one. Lee, he couldn't have dreamed for anyone more competent and capable. In 1985, Dr. Goh was awarded the country's highest honor when he was bestowed with the Order of Temasek First Class. He put Singapore on a fast track to the First World. Lee Kuan Yew, in a letter to Dr. Goh, had written, quote, "A whole generation of Singaporeans take their present standard of living for granted because you had laid the foundation for the economy of modern Singapore." End quote. Cabinet Minister E.W. Barker stood up in a meeting of the Legislative Assembly and recounted a story regarding how Lee Kuan Yew was telling him to try and convince Dr. Goh not to retire just yet. Well, he mentioned to all the assembled in that Parliament building that day that he didn't do what the Prime Minister asked because, in his opinion, quote, Dr. Goh had done more than enough for Singapore, end quote. Dr. Goh made Singapore an attractive location for investors and multinationals looking for a corruption-free government that offered top-rate public services, utilities, a stable currency, and sound fiscal policy. He had led Singapore's transition away from entrepot trade to manufacturing, transportation, logistics, and global finance. And Singapore's location, that had always served it well throughout its history, gave it access to not just regional, but global markets. The PAP always styled itself as incorruptible. They put very unforgiving anti-corruption laws in place. No one was immune. A meritocracy was instituted that truly offered upward mobility to those technocrats who were born overachievers and who punched above their weight in their jobs. There was a pathway to success. This was a kind of a Confucian belief that a person of talent, if used correctly by the ruler, could make all the difference in offering the people good governance. Just the other day before I recorded this, Singapore's former transport minister, S. Iswaran, was jailed for a year on corruption charges, and he wasn't the first cabinet minister to see the inside of a jail cell, though he's the first in half a century. And Lee Kuan Yew championed this revolutionary idea of paying his civil servants salaries comparable to what they might earn working in the private sector. He shared that same passion that other rulers throughout Chinese history had about attracting these extraordinary talents. Paying competitive salaries would attract more quality professionals and lead them to turn away from the temptation of government kickbacks and bribes. That education system that Raffles himself first championed, over the years was continuously improved and enhanced and taken seriously. And this tradition ultimately helped produce generations of capable and talented Singaporeans who joined the civil service or the SAF, an incorruptible meritocracy. That was the ideal to shoot for. When the PAP came to power in 1959, they took this seriously. And the second generation of leadership, like Goh Chok Tong, who I'll mention later, were all brought up in this system. In July of 1967, Britain dropped a bombshell by announcing it was going to wind things down at Sembawang Naval Base. You might ask, what's so bad about that? Well, up till that time, just as Dr. Goh was hustling to crank up the new Singapore economy, Sembawang employed about 70,000 people. It was still the country's largest employer, accounting for a sizable chunk of Singapore's GDP. And besides that, there was also that extra layer of national security provided by this military base. The earliest policies that sought to boost local industrialization and employ people helped to soften the blow of the British pullout at Sembawang. The government, they tried to turn those lemons into lemonade by converting the base into a commercial shipyard. It was a long-term project, but it would pay off in the end. In 1968, Lee Kuan Yew reached out to Uncle Sam, who was ready, willing, and able to replace Britain as Singapore's new security partner. In late 1969 and into 1970, Lee Kuan Yew took a sabbatical from government and spent time in the USA doing a little PR work for Singapore and looking for anything useful that could be applied to Singapore. This trip did a lot to build a new, and as it turned out, lasting relationship with the United States, both politically and militarily. He was all in with Team America during the Vietnam War years. The U.S. became Singapore's main defense supplier throughout the 1970s and into the 80s, and Singapore became one of the most important cogs in the wheel of the U.S. defense establishment. And this strategic relationship continues into our present day, and it all stemmed from that sabbatical to the United States by Lee Kuan Yew. Lee's son, the current senior minister, later enrolled at the U.S. Army Command and General Staff College at Fort Leavenworth, and like his father did, Lee Hsien Loong also enrolled at the Kennedy School at Harvard between 1979 and 80 and received a master's in public administration. He's a brigadier general rank in the SAF. And let me just quickly add, since we're talking about the year 1969, there was another race riot in Singapore that's usually mentioned along with the riots in 1964. This one that happened in 1969 was caused by events that occurred in Malaysia in mid-May when UMNO lost a bunch of seats to the Malaysian People's Movement Party and the Democratic Action Party. It all started with a provocative act to celebrate their showing in the elections and rub it in the faces of the local Malays. With all that kindling around, waiting to be ignited, riots erupted that went down mostly in Kuala Lumpur between ethnic Malays and Chinese. These were not your average letting off a little steam kind of riots. They became quite violent. Hundreds of people were killed and injured. It was so bad that it led to the resignation of Tunku Abdul Rahman. 2 weeks after these horrific riots in Malaysia, the tension wafted down into Singapore. Local Malays and Singaporean criminal gangs went at it, and over a period of intense rioting that lasted for a whole week, 4 people were killed and more than 80 injured. The ISD, or Internal Security Department, had to be called in to bang heads and restore order. Though calm returned to the streets of Singapore, the hard feelings and enmity still remained. If you have no interest whatsoever in the shipping industry, you may want to fast forward. No pun intended, but a sea change occurred in the early 1960s that Singapore completely embraced, and this was the container revolution. Driving around the streets of major cities and suburbs, tractor trailers pulling 40-foot shipping containers is about as ubiquitous a sight as you could find. Driving around LA, especially around the major distribution centers adjacent to the 10 and 60 freeways, they're everywhere. Prior to the 1960s, you didn't see these standardized shipping containers. Neither did you see these massive container ships with these boxes stacked one on top of the other. When this new kind of intermodal transport all started to happen, the government knew this would dovetail perfectly with Singapore's long-term planning to become a global shipping and distribution center. They were very fast out of the starting gates in the matter of cargo handling and the computer technologies that managed the whole operation. In recognizing what the future portended in the shipping industry, Singapore quickly became, and still is, one of the most efficient cargo handling operations on Earth. There was more to it than simply the port location. There was also the intricate logistics involved in transshipment, with insurance, maritime arbitration, refueling, ship repairs, and 100 other things. I'm not sure if any of you remember way back when, but there was this reclusive billionaire named Daniel K. Ludwig, who in 1982 was ranked by Forbes as the richest man in the world. He had mega projects going on all over the world and pioneered the invention, design, and construction of these massive supertankers and bulk commodity vessels. He built these ships in Japan at a time when Japan was just starting to shift into industrial high gear. Recognizing this was the future of the shipping industry, container berths were built at the port to handle these gigantic vessels that are much smaller than the gigantic container vessels of our day. That Singapore bet big on this, and it's been quite a payoff. This container revolution only started in the early 60s, and by 1983, half of all the cargo being unloaded came from these standardized shipping containers. The beauty of these containers is that a factory can produce goods that could be loaded into one of these containers at their loading dock. Then it could fit on a truck that took it to the port. There at the port, loading equipment designed specifically to handle these standard-sized shipping containers, like gantry cranes, straddle carriers, and reach stackers, and they meticulously placed each container on the vessel. And when the ship sailed to its destination, each container could be offloaded and placed on a truck that's taken to its destination and unloaded at the warehouse, and finally, onward to your front door. So at the time of this seismic change in the global shipping industry, once more, Singapore was perfectly positioned to take advantage of the opportunity and ride that wave to infinity and beyond. We remember it with gutta percha and the submarine cables, with tin right when the worldwide canning industry took off, then with rubber and the automobile industry, and again with petroleum when diesel-powered ships began sailing the seven seas. Singapore's whole trading nervous system, from the individual tycoons managing their enterprises to the shipping companies exporting the goods from the port, they had these, in some cases, century-old relationships who always came together when global changes in demand and innovation happened. And many of these tycoons who cooperated with the government or with each other on mega projects raked in these obscene profits, but you can't argue that as they rose, so did Singapore's economy and all the boats that rose with that rising tide. The port of Singapore was spread out among 5 locations off the south coast, and with all the investment in equipment and training, it became the most modern and advanced in the world. And all this innovation and new technologies put a lot of stevedores out of business. Yeah, I'm sure it's something to see. All those moving parts of the port of Singapore on a busy day, All the loading, unloading, refueling, and whatnot going on at full tilt. Look at it today and consider how humbly and primitively it all started out. What Wang Dayuan witnessed in 1330 or Raffles in 1819. If they only could have seen what the Singapore they saw looked like today. When the People's Action Party first started out, they pitched a big tent and invited a lot of labor unions and left-leaning folks to join their party. Then, as we saw, they were pushed out of the PAP and many of them imprisoned. We looked at that last time. After 1965 and into the 1970s, this eyebrow-raising kind of thing continued, and for anyone who favored unfettered freedom of the press and communist-leading labor unions and the like, well, things changed quite a bit. Freedom of the press was the first to go. If you had nothing good to say, keep it to yourself. Opposition figures were muzzled in all the well-known ways, and if that meant detention or being expelled from the country, so be it. And with the opposition parties either weak or not plentiful enough, it was the start of a political good luck streak for the PAP that lasted for decades of elections. In the April 1968 election, the PAP won almost every seat. It helped that the opposition boycotted that election. Newspapers were also reined in and moved under a single umbrella that sang from the same hymnal. Same deal with the trade unions, with all the firebrands put away. This wasn't as difficult to do as it could have been. There were citizens who hated this, didn't mind, or for their own reasons, were just fine with the system. In other words, there was a wide bandwidth of opinions about living under a government with nanny or parental tendencies and a heck of a heavy hand. But when you think about it, in one form or another, Singaporeans always had to deal with that. But one person's repression is another person's era of good feeling. So, PM Lee Kuan Yew, after 1965, more and more began to show his political and socioeconomic conservative tendencies. And though his job description kept him busy 18 hours a day, Lee also took a personal interest in cultivating this next generation of talents. This could be seen in the elite officer corps that began in the SAF and nudged its way into the political side of the government. We got them here in the USA, the elites. In Singapore's case, perhaps upper middle class, English-speaking, ethnic Chinese. If they had the right stuff, they got to the front of the line. And if they were any good, they rose up the Singapore cursus honorum faster. When the Deng Xiaoping era began in 1978 and the PRC got into the Baihua business in a big way, when all the labels of everything we bought started to say made in China, the Singapore government saw rough waters ahead. All those industries Singaporean manufacturers had bet big on in the 1960s and 70s, well, they were about to get run out of business. Not only China, but Malaysia and Indonesia as well were giving Singaporean consumer products factories intense competition. High tech was the answer, and as we can look back and see from our 2024 or 2025 perch, not a bad strategy to have bet on at the dawn of the 1980s. Not all of these policies and investments in these new technologies succeeded or went as planned, but most did work as intended and are still around today. When new government pronouncements are made or new infrastructure has to be built, well, no one likes it when they have to be the ones to endure all the short-term pain and suffering. There's an old Chinese saying that goes, "Ku Jin Gan Lai," sweetness follows the bitter. You gotta pay your dues if you want to sing the blues. These earliest policies of the 60s and 70s, like in Jurong, well, as challenging as they were for many, they began to bear fruit in the 1980s. A lot of people had been relocated out to the suburbs, filling up government and private flats as soon as they could be built. Toh Chin Chai retired as health minister in 1981, Goh Keng Swee as deputy prime minister in 1984, and S. Rajaratnam as the first senior minister in 1988. If there's one lesson history has taught us since the most ancient times of Sumer, Babylon, and along the Yellow River, the old guard always has to pass the torch to the next generation. try as these rulers did with elixirs and magic potions, no one achieved physical immortality. And this rite of passage happened in Singapore. Pretty much all who was left was Lee Kuan Yew. You know, Lee always gets a ribbing every now and then from writers who, pick through all his achievements and point to his more controversial decisions. His eugenics-inspired social policies for population control and to incentivize college-educated young women to have more children are usually trotted out the most. Insisting on English and Mandarin as the lingua francas, well, it didn't do much to help perpetuate the passing on of dialects such as Hokkien, Teochew, and Hakka. What everyone else wanted for Singapore was their own business. Basically, Lee Kuan Yew and his government never took their eyes off the ball. Infrastructure aside, they aimed to provide the best education opportunities, access to decent housing and health care that's the envy of the world. At the same time, in a multiracial society such as Singapore, Chinese, Malay, Indian, Eurasian, he promoted multilingualism and multiracialism. And if you can do that, the rest falls into place. He got personally involved in cultivating a system that produced well-educated young people, many of whom are running the Singaporean government today. Yeah, all that great stuff. But the 1980s was also a period of authoritarian rule. Controls to free speech, on the press, on labor unions and opposition parties. Some of the penalties were quite draconian. I think we're going to let the curtain fall here and finish off the series next time in part 10. I'll introduce the second generation of leadership and how Singapore fared in the 1980s up to our day. Until the next time, when we meet again on the Avenue, this is Laszlo Montgomery signing off from lovely Los Angeles, California. I look forward to seeing you again next time for another exciting episode of the China History Podcast.